But to me, I just think that to be able to write, because everything begins with a story.
She spent 60 years making sure the world only ever saw the parts of her life she wanted them to see. 4 days before she died, Dolly Parton was still on camera, still smiling, still telling people she had more work to do. What almost nobody outside her inner circle understood was how little time was actually left. And when the man who had guarded her privacy for more than 20 years finally stood in front of a camera to explain what really happened in her final days, he revealed something about the way she prepared for her own death that a lot of people were not expecting. Dolly Parton did not get to where she got by accident, and she did not get there easily either. She was born into a family with 12 children, in a small cabin in the mountains of East Tennessee, in a house without running water and rarely enough food to go around some weeks. Nobody handed her anything. She started writing songs as a little girl because music was the one thing in that cabin that belonged entirely to her. Singing in church shaped her voice long before any record label ever noticed her. That upbringing, that very specific brand of poverty, became the foundation of almost everything she built afterward, from the songs to the theme park to the literacy charity that would eventually put more than 300 million books into children's hands around the world. By the time most people assumed Dolly had already made it, that her life was set and untouchable, she was actually walking straight into some of the hardest years of her adult life. In the 1980s, while her career was exploding across film, television, and music all at once, her body was quietly falling apart behind the scenes. She had been dealing with severe endometriosis for years by then, a painful condition that eventually forced her hand. In 1984, at just 38 years old, she underwent a partial hysterectomy. That surgery meant she would never carry a biological child, something she had wanted since she was a young woman. She has talked openly since then about how deeply that loss affected her, how it pulled her into a depression she never saw coming, at the exact moment the rest of the world assumed her life was reaching its peak. She was also still carrying the emotional weight of another rupture from years earlier, her split from Porter Wagoner's show, the platform that had first introduced her to a national audience. That breakup didn't stay quiet. It turned into a lawsuit, with Wagoner accusing her of breach of contract and seeking a substantial sum in damages. The dispute eventually settled, but it left a lasting strain between two people who had once built something together. For Dolly, walking away from that show wasn't just a career move. It was the moment she had to prove publicly that she could stand on her own without the man who had helped make her a household name. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, she was working around the clock, dealing with emotional eating and weight swings that she's spoken about since, propping up a public image of a woman who never stopped smiling while privately trying to hold herself together. That gap between the Dolly people saw on television and the Dolly living through all of that behind closed doors became one of the defining tensions of her private life for years. Then there was the grief that just kept arriving, decade after decade. Her parents passed. Her siblings passed, one after another, slowly thinning out the enormous family she had grown up surrounded by in that Tennessee cabin. Family had always been the center of how Dolly understood herself, and watching that original circle shrink year after year was its own kind of long, quiet loss that never really let up. And then, in March of 2025, came the loss that changed everything that followed. Her husband, Carl Dean, died at 82 years old after 58 years of marriage. Carl was about as far from a celebrity spouse as it's possible to get. He almost never appeared in public alongside her, and he avoided the entertainment world completely, never chasing a single ounce of the fame that followed his wife everywhere she went. That near-total absence fueled decades of tabloid speculation about whether their marriage was even real, and Dolly spent nearly 60 years refusing to answer those questions on anyone's terms but her own. She protected Carl's privacy the way she protected almost nothing else in her life, keeping him out of the interviews, out of the red carpets, out of the machine that surrounded everything else she touched. When Carl died, she lost the one person who had shared the completely private version of her life, the version almost nobody else was ever allowed to see. She has since said, in her own words, that she let some of her own health issues slide while she was focused on caring for him during his final years, a choice that would end up shaping the last chapter of her own life as well. That admission matters because it's the thread that connects almost everything that happened next. Through 2025 and into 2026, Dolly's health problems kept surfacing in public in small, scattered pieces, never quite adding up to the full picture. Kidney stones. An infection tied to those stones. Exhaustion serious enough to reshape her schedule. A long-anticipated Las Vegas residency that had to be pushed back from its original December 2025 dates. In May of 2026, she told fans directly that she was responding well to treatment but needed more time before she'd have the physical stamina to get back on a stage. She sounded hopeful in that update. She talked like someone planning a comeback, not someone quietly running out of time. In August, another sign appeared. Dolly was supposed to show up at Dollywood for the dedication of a brand new attraction, an event tied to the park that carries her name and in many ways, tells her own story. She couldn't make it. She sent a video instead, explaining that she'd been dealing with severe dizziness and dehydration, serious enough that her doctor told her flatly not to travel. For a woman who had rarely missed a chance to show up for anything connected to Dollywood in nearly 40 years, that absence said more than the message itself did. 4 days before she died, she gave what turned out to be her last public update, speaking with People magazine. She acknowledged she was still dealing with real health issues, some of which she admitted she hadn't paid close enough attention to while she was busy caring for Carl. She talked about her determination to keep pushing forward. There was nothing in that update that read like a goodbye. It read like someone still planning her next project, still thinking in terms of what came after this rough patch, not in terms of an ending. On August 25, 2026, Dolly Parton died at Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center in Nashville. She was 80 years old. Her representatives later confirmed the cause as a short battle with cancer, one she had kept almost entirely out of public view, even as she talked openly about kidney problems and exhaustion in the months leading up to her death. The specific diagnosis was never made public. For a woman who had spent decades letting people believe they knew everything about her, that was one more thing she chose to keep entirely for herself, right up to the very end. The tributes that followed were enormous and came from every direction, because Dolly was never really contained by just one industry or one generation of fans. She was a songwriter whose work became standards in other people's voices, covered and recovered for decades after she first wrote them. A country star who crossed over into pop culture without ever pretending she'd left the mountains behind. A film and television actress with a career stretching across multiple decades. The owner of a theme park that turned a stretch of rural Tennessee into one of the most visited tourist destinations in the entire country. And the founder of a literacy program that had, by the time she died, given away more than 300 million books to children around the world. Musicians across genres and generations, including younger artists like Sabrina Carpenter, spoke publicly about what her songwriting and her generosity had personally meant to them. But in the weeks leading up to her death, Dolly had already been quietly setting things in motion, almost as if some part of her knew what was coming. One of her final in-person public appearances came in June of 2026, at a ribbon cutting for a new travel stop business bearing her name in Cornersville, Tennessee. She showed up in full rhinestone glam, cracking jokes about a competing travel chain, working the room the exact way she always had, cameras and all. Nobody watching that day had any idea it would end up being one of the last times she'd appear in front of a crowd in person. By August 19, just 6 days before she died, she was still working, just in a different way than before. She appeared in a pre-recorded video at the Academy of Country Music Honors to accept the ACM Poets Award, an honor recognizing her decades of work as a songwriter. It was a fitting one because writing songs was the thing that started all of it, long before the movies, the theme park, or any of the rest of the empire she eventually built. She didn't have to travel to accept it in person, but she made sure she was still part of the moment anyway. She was also still building things meant to outlast her entirely. She had been developing an autobiographical Broadway musical based on her own life, tracing her path from that mountain cabin to Nashville and beyond, with plans to bring it to the stage later in 2026. And in a move that says a lot about how she thought about her own legacy, she recorded a brand new unreleased song called My Place in History, and had it sealed inside a wooden time capsule at Dollywood's Dreammore Resort, alongside a vintage CD player and cassette player. The instructions were specific. It isn't supposed to be opened until 2046, on the resort's 30th anniversary, a full 20 years after her death. She wrote a message for an audience she knew she would never get to actually meet. On top of that, she'd also been working on a cookbook with her sisters, built around the Southern food and family traditions she'd grown up with, another piece of her own history that she wanted preserved in her words rather than left for someone else to reconstruct later. When the news of her death finally broke, it wasn't a publicist or a record label executive who delivered it. It was Brian Seaver, her nephew, who had spent more than 20 years as the head of her security team, following in the footsteps of his own father, who had held that exact same role before him. In the video statement he posted, Seaver explained that Dolly had asked him years earlier to be the one to make this announcement whenever the time came. He said knowing that day was coming eventually didn't make it any easier to actually stand there and say it out loud. He described the moment as an honor mixed with real heavy grief, but he was careful to frame the sadness as something belonging to the people left behind, not to Dolly herself. He said she had lived in the light, and that he believed she was now reunited with Carl and the rest of her family who had gone before her. Seaver's closeness to Dolly wasn't only professional. It was family, built over decades of protecting the boundary she worked so hard to maintain between her public self and her private one. That boundary held all the way to the very end. His public statement didn't turn into a medical briefing. He didn't lay out clinical details, timelines, or a play-by-play of her final hours. He talked about the woman his family actually knew, which stayed very much in keeping with how Dolly had always handled her own story. Generous with some parts of herself and completely unwilling to hand over others, no matter how much attention surrounded her. What Seaver did share, though, was just how deliberately she had planned for this exact moment. According to her representatives, Dolly had specifically requested a small, private funeral limited to immediate family, rather than any kind of large public event. She asked that fans and admirers honor her from a distance instead, through their own personal tributes and memories rather than by attending a service in person. She'll be laid to rest beside Carl Dean at Woodlawn Memorial Park and Mausoleum in Nashville, in the very same mausoleum where he was buried after his own death the year before. Even the small details she left behind felt entirely like her. She had arranged to be buried in her signature high heels, paired with a simple, comfortable cotton dress underneath. Decades of rhinestones and elaborate stage costumes, and in the end she chose comfort right alongside the glamour, a small detail that says a lot about who she actually was underneath the persona the whole world thought it knew. Her family also asked that, instead of flowers, people consider donating to Dolly Parton's Imagination Library, the literacy nonprofit she founded in honor of her own father, Robert Lee Parton, a man who never learned to read or write. Over the years, that program grew into an initiative reaching children across multiple countries, and her family made a point of saying that keeping that work alive was one of the clearest ways they wanted her remembered going forward. What stands out, looking back over all of it, isn't some hidden scandal or some secret nobody was ever allowed to know about. It's how much care went into every part of how she chose to leave. She spent her whole career deciding exactly what the world got to see and exactly when it got to see it, and she carried that same instinct straight into planning her own death, right down to who would make the announcement, what she'd be buried in, and where donations should go instead of flowers. Even her final months, filled with canceled appearances and quiet health struggles she rarely discussed in detail, were shaped by a woman who was still working, still building things for people who wouldn't hear from her again until years after she was already gone. It's worth sitting with just how fast the shift actually happened for the public watching from the outside. One week, Dolly was still recording video updates, still cracking jokes, still talking about a Broadway musical and a cookbook and a song locked away for the year 2046. The next week, the headlines had already moved on to funeral arrangements and tributes. That speed is part of why the news landed so hard for so many people. There wasn't a long, visible decline stretched out across months for the public to brace for. There was a woman who kept showing up, in whatever form she still could, right up until she simply couldn't anymore. It also says something that even in the final stretch, when her body clearly wasn't cooperating, she kept choosing to participate rather than disappear. She didn't cancel the ACM Poets Award appearance outright. She pre-recorded it instead. She didn't quietly shelve the Broadway project. She kept developing it. She didn't let the Dollywood absence go unexplained. She sent her own video message in her own voice, telling people directly what was happening rather than leaving that job to a publicist. Every one of those choices lines up with the same pattern. Control the message, protect the people around her, and keep working until working simply wasn't possible anymore. That's really the story her nephew ended up telling when he finally spoke publicly. Not some shocking secret hiding underneath the surface, but a woman who planned her own goodbye with the same care she poured into everything else she ever built in her lifetime, and who made absolutely sure the people she loved most were the ones standing closest when it finally came time to say it. If this video meant something to you, drop a comment about the Dolly Parton song or memory that means the most to you, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.